Why don't you think you're good enough? The words echoed in her mind as she stepped out of the interview room, though no one had actually spoken them aloud. The silence of the office felt heavier than any criticism. She had walked in with confidence, with preparation, with years of experience stacked neatly like files in her mind, and yet, by the time she left, it felt as if she had been invisible. Have you ever felt that way? Like your effort, your talent, your very presence was somehow dismissed without reason. Today, we want to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Which city, which street, which home? Take a moment to think about that as you listen, and while you do, consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't yet, and hitting that like button so we can continue bringing these stories to life. Now, let us take you into the day that changed everything. The day she realized how fragile fairness can be. Her name was Alia, a young black woman in her mid-20s with a mind sharp and ready, with dreams built on late nights and early mornings, and with hope that had carried her through every obstacle up until this moment. Today, she had been invited to interview for a position at one of the most prestigious companies in the city, a role that could redefine her career, that could open doors she had only imagined from afar. She had arrived early, dressed impeccably, her resume polished, her portfolio ready to impress. Every answer had been rehearsed, every point considered, yet the moment she entered the office, a subtle coldness brushed against her like an invisible wall. The receptionist barely acknowledged her, the waiting room felt stiff with quiet judgment, and other candidates, seemingly unburdened by any need to prove themselves, smiled and laughed easily. When her turn came, the interview began. At first, everything seemed routine, but soon, the unease grew. Her questions were met with minimal engagement, her explanations were interrupted, her accomplishments shrugged off as though they were nothing more than a footnote. She spoke calmly, confidently, yet each word seemed to float into a void. The person across the table took notes without looking at her, glanced at their phone more often than at her face, and answered questions with a formality that bordered on indifference. Alia felt the weight of being unseen pressing against her chest, a quiet suffocation born not from hostility, but from disregard. Her mind raced as she tried to reconcile what she knew she had to offer with the way she was being received. Every carefully prepared story, every example of her skill and dedication, met only with polite nods or distracted glances. She fought to maintain composure, to let nothing break her concentration, yet inside, a storm brewed. Her confidence was intact, but the realization of bias, the invisible yet unmistakable current running through the room, was undeniable. Time seemed both fast and slow, every minute stretching as she answered questions that seemed trivial in comparison to the knowledge and talent she carried. The silence that followed her responses was loud, oppressive, a weight that made her aware of every small movement, every intake of breath she made. And yet, she remained composed. She smiled when appropriate, nodded thoughtfully, asked clarifying questions, showing the kind of professional grace that many admire but few truly practice under pressure. It was not a battle of words, but a test of endurance, and she endured. When the interview concluded, she rose, thanked the panel politely, and stepped back into the hall, carrying the tension with her like a cloak. She walked through the building, the polished floors reflecting her determined steps, and she could feel the eyes of some lingering, assessing, perhaps dismissing, but she refused to turn her energy toward anger. Outside, the city moved on, unaware of the quiet struggle unfolding in one office room, but for Alia, the day had already left its mark. Sitting down at a small cafe nearby, she let herself exhale, though her mind refused to release the questions that pressed relentlessly. Why had her competence been invisible? How had her preparation, her experience, her skill, been reduced to nothing in the eyes of those who were meant to judge fairly? It was a question that, she knew, stretched far beyond this one office, one interview, one company. It was a question of fairness, of recognition, of the subtle prejudices that often go unseen, yet cut deeply. She sipped her coffee slowly, feeling the warmth of it against her hands, grounding herself in the moment, reminding herself of the effort that had brought her here, and the patience she would need to carry forward. This was only the beginning, she realized. The real challenge was not the interview itself, but what she would do next, how she would confront the injustice without losing the poise that had defined her all along. She remembered the countless nights she had stayed up refining her skills, the sacrifices, the doubts she had quietly conquered. None of that was erased by the indifference of a few people in a room. And yet, she could not ignore it. She felt the weight of society's silent judgments pressing down, the subtle dismissals that often went unchallenged, the quiet message that some people, no matter how prepared or capable, would have to fight harder to be seen. And so, she sat there, gathering her thoughts, letting the city hum around her, letting the world continue on its pace, while she prepared for what had to come next. The question remained, how could one person confront such invisible barriers, such quiet injustice, and still emerge intact, respected, and triumphant? As the morning sunlight spilled across the table, reflecting off her coffee cup, she made a silent promise to herself. She would not let this moment define her, but it would fuel her determination. She would find a way to make her voice heard, to prove her worth, not just to the people who doubted her, but to the world that so often overlooked those like her. And in that quiet determination, in that steadfast refusal to shrink, to step back, to accept invisibility, she began to understand the power that lay in being noticed by everyone, but in holding one's ground with dignity, with patience, and with unwavering self-respect. This was the first act of her journey, the moment before the storm, the calm before the fight, the point where every observer's glance, every slight, every pause and acknowledgement became a challenge she would meet, not with anger, but with quiet, relentless strength, a strength that, though unseen by most, radiated from her in every carefully measured step and every deliberate breath. The next morning, the memory of yesterday's interview lingered like a shadow she could not shake. Alia sat at a small cafe, the city humming around her, the chatter of people blending with the distant hum of traffic, but none of it reached her, not really. She replayed every moment in her mind, every glance, every pause, every dismissive gesture. It was not just an interview, it was a test she had passed flawlessly in her own eyes, yet the world had chosen to ignore her. She had arrived early, prepared to impress, to demonstrate skill and intelligence honed over years of dedication, and yet, in the end, it seemed to matter little. Others had been celebrated, their presence acknowledged, their accomplishments praised, while hers had been met with silence, a subtle but unmistakable exclusion. She watched the people passing by, each wrapped in their own routines, their own assumptions, oblivious to the quiet injustice unfolding in her mind. How many times had this happened, she wondered, not just in interviews, but in classrooms, workplaces, social gatherings, moments where talent was disregarded, overlooked, and undervalued simply because it did not fit the expectations of those in power. Her heart ached with the weight of familiarity, a story repeated countless times, yet her determination refused to waver. She had always believed that competence and perseverance would be enough to carry her forward, that merit alone would be recognized. And now she realized how fragile that belief could be when confronted with bias so subtle, so pervasive, that it could render one invisible in the midst of acknowledgement for others. Her phone buzzed with notifications she barely noticed, emails and messages from friends and colleagues, yet the message she longed for most had not arrived. She thought of the email she would never receive, the congratulatory call she was denied, the handshake that had been given to someone else, and the unfairness burned like a quiet fire in her chest. She thought of her parents, of the sacrifices made so that she could be here, educated, prepared, standing on the edge of a career she had dreamed of for years. How would they feel if they knew that the doors she had worked so hard to open were closed not by circumstance, but by prejudice? Her hands wrapped around her coffee cup, seeking warmth, grounding herself, yet the chill of disappointment lingered. She allowed herself a moment to reflect, to feel the injustice fully, knowing that acknowledgement of it was the first step toward reclaiming her power. It was not enough to simply endure. She had to confront it, to find a way to transform this silent dismissal into a statement that could not be ignored. She remembered the stories she had read, the accounts of others who had faced similar obstacles, and she felt a surge of connection, A quiet reassurance that she was not alone in this struggle. But recognition alone would not change her circumstances. Action was required. She thought through her options carefully, weighing the risks, the consequences, the courage required to speak up, to challenge a system that so easily dismissed her presence. The memory of the interview room remained vivid, the way her words had seemed to vanish into a void, the subtle gestures that communicated disregard without a single cruel word. She knew that confrontation would not be easy. It would not be met with applause or immediate understanding. And yet, she felt the stirrings of a plan, a way to make her voice heard without sacrificing the composure and professionalism that had defined her throughout her life. She drafted emails in her mind, polished arguments and evidence, considered the platforms and avenues through which her story might reach the ears and eyes of those who could effect change. She envisioned her words, clear and unwavering, exposing the unfairness with precision, highlighting the contrast between merit and recognition, between preparation and opportunity. And as she sat there, the city continuing its indifferent rhythm around her, she allowed herself to imagine the moment when justice would finally meet her effort, when her skills would be acknowledged. Not because of favoritism or bias, but because they deserved to be. In her mind, she could see the responses unfolding, the surprise, the reconsideration, the acknowledgement that what had been overlooked was not because of lack of ability, but because of prejudice she had no control over. Her heart beat steadily, a reminder that while the world could attempt to silence her, it could not extinguish her determination. She made a decision, a quiet but firm commitment that she would not let yesterday define her, that she would not allow the invisible hand of bias to dictate the trajectory of her life. Instead, she would craft a response, a declaration of competence and worth, a testament to the countless hours, the tireless work, the unshakable dedication that had brought her to this point. She thought of the people who might read her words, who might see themselves reflected in her experience, who might find strength in her courage to speak despite the risks. And in that thought, she found a deeper purpose, a reason to move forward, to transform personal disappointment into collective awareness. She imagined sending her message, watching as it spread, hearing the echoes of recognition ripple through the walls of the corporation, through social networks, reaching ears and eyes that might not have noticed her otherwise. The sense of anticipation was electric, a charged tension that held both fear and hope in equal measure. Every detail of her preparation, every careful articulation, every piece of evidence meticulously collected, became a weapon not of aggression, but of truth, a way to confront injustice without abandoning dignity. And though the path ahead was uncertain, though resistance was inevitable, she felt a strength she had not known she possessed, a quiet, unyielding force that would carry her through the storm of indifference and bias. She sat back, let the sunlight wash over her hands and the table before her, feeling the warmth seep into her skin, grounding her, reminding her that she was alive, that she had agency, that she could act. The decision had been made. The plan was set, and somewhere in the quiet determination of that moment, Aaliyah realized that while the world could attempt to render her invisible, she had the power to make herself seen, to transform silence into a voice that demanded to be heard, and that voice would not be ignored, because it carried not anger but truth, not complaint but unwavering evidence of skill, talent, and deserved recognition. The storm had not yet broken, the challenge was not yet over, but for the first time since she had left the office, she felt the faint but undeniable stirrings of hope, a momentum that could not be denied, a momentum that would propel her toward justice and acknowledgement. And she allowed herself to imagine the moment when her efforts, her preparation, her dedication, and her voice would finally meet the recognition they had earned. Aaliyah woke to the morning with the quiet determination that pulsed through her veins like a current she could not ignore. Yesterday had been a lesson in invisibility, a demonstration of how merit could be ignored when prejudice whispered in the corners of judgment. And today she would speak not with anger, but with the precision and clarity that had always defined her work. She drafted her message carefully, each sentence weighed and measured, every word carrying the weight of truth, every detail a piece of undeniable evidence of her skill, her preparation, and the injustice she had faced. She sent the message to the company, to the corporate blog, to her network, and let it ripple outward, reaching eyes and ears that might otherwise have overlooked her presence. Within hours, the response was unlike anything she had expected. Colleagues she had never met reached out with words of support. Strangers on professional forums shared their admiration. And slowly, the silence that had tried to erase her began to crack. The story traveled through emails, messages, social media posts, and comments, each one a validation, each one a recognition that her experience was not isolated, that her voice, finally raised, could not be ignored. Mr. Stanley and the leadership team found themselves confronted with the reality of their own biases, their decisions, no longer shielded by the quiet walls of routine. They reached out to her, first with formal emails, then with invitations to meet, to discuss, to rectify what had been wrong. When she entered the room that day, there was a tension that had not existed before, a quiet acknowledgement that this was not the same meeting as yesterday. She spoke calmly, presenting her case with evidence, articulating her experience and the undeniable truth of her capability, and for the first time, she felt the room listening, truly listening, without dismissal, without interruption, without disregard. The recognition was not immediate, but it was undeniable. Offers were made, apologies extended, and an opportunity presented that exceeded the one she had been denied. She had not demanded revenge or confrontation. She had demanded recognition, and it had arrived, not through shouting or anger, but through the quiet, unshakable power of truth. Colleagues congratulated her. The people who had overlooked her yesterday now acknowledged her with respect, and the subtle currents of bias that had tried to erase her were, at least in this instance, confronted with clarity. Elia allowed herself a moment to breathe, to feel the weight lift slightly from her shoulders, a testament to patience, perseverance, and unwavering belief in her own worth. She reflected on the journey from invisibility to recognition, on the quiet moments of strength that had carried her through the storm of indifference, and on the realization that dignity and calm determination often have a louder voice than anger ever could. The lesson was clear. The world may attempt to diminish you, to ignore your effort, to overlook your merit, but the truth, carefully articulated, has a power that cannot be denied. She walked away from the meeting with a sense of accomplishment that was not just personal, but symbolic, a statement to anyone who had ever been dismissed, overlooked, or undervalued. Her victory was not in confrontation, but in the quiet persistence that demanded to be acknowledged. She thought of every early morning, every late night, every sacrifice made to reach this point, and she felt a profound sense of pride, not just in the outcome, but in the unbroken spirit that had brought her here. She realized that injustice, while painful, could become a catalyst for action, a reason to elevate one's voice, and a reminder that merit and perseverance, when combined with patience and strategy, can overcome even the most subtle forms of discrimination. The city outside continued its rhythm, oblivious to the personal triumphs and reckonings that had unfolded within the walls of the corporation, yet for Elia, nothing felt ordinary anymore. Every glance, every acknowledgement, every word of support reinforced the truth she had carried all along. Her value was inherent, undeniable, and impossible to erase, and as she stepped out into the sunlight, feeling its warmth on her face, she understood that this was not the end, but a beginning of a career, a reputation, and a voice that would be heard, respected, and recognized. The storm of yesterday had passed, leaving behind clarity, dignity, and a quiet sense of empowerment that no prejudice could touch. The lesson, carved, not through confrontation, but through the steadfast persistence of truth, lingered in her mind. Strength is found not in being loud, but in being consistent, in being patient, in standing firm when the world attempts to look past you. Elia smiled faintly to herself, a small, fragile, yet resilient smile, knowing that she had not just proven her worth to others, but reaffirmed it to herself. And in that affirmation lay a quiet, unshakable victory. And now, dear viewer, as you have followed her journey through struggle, doubt, and the quiet triumph of truth, remember that these stories are here to remind us all of resilience and dignity. If this story resonated with you, Take a moment to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next story, and give this video a like to show your support for the voices that deserve to be heard.